The Kodama and Nioh aren't just cute collectibles. They're a complete cultural violation that would horrify traditional Japanese spiritual practitioners. What Team Ninja created for their game represents one of the most problematic adaptations of sacred mythology in gaming history, and the implications go far deeper than most players realize. Most gamers see Kodama as helpful little green spirits that give you benefits when you find them. The common belief is that game developers simply took a Japanese folklore concept and made it more game-friendly. But here's what actually happened. They transformed sacred guardian spirits into commodified collectibles, fundamentally altering the spiritual relationship these beings represent. Today I'm going to reveal what real Kodama are in Japanese mythology, explain why Nioh's interpretation is so spiritually problematic, and show you how this misrepresentation reflects a broader crisis in how Western media consumes Eastern spiritual traditions. Let me start with something that will completely reframe how you see these spirits. In authentic Japanese folklore, Kodama aren't individual creatures you can collect or befriend. They're the collective consciousness of entire forests, ancient, powerful, and absolutely not something you'd want to disturb casually. The word Kodama combines Ko, meaning tree, and Dama, meaning spirit or soul. But this isn't just any spirit. Kodama represent what Shinto practitioners call Jinju no Mori, the sacred groves that serve as the dwelling places of kami, the divine forces that govern natural phenomena. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and how the weather is there today. I'm always fascinated by how different climates shape our relationship with nature and spiritual concepts. Here's what makes this particularly significant. Traditional Kodama don't just inhabit trees. They are the spiritual essence of the forest ecosystem itself. When a forest reaches sufficient age and complexity, the interconnected spiritual energy of all its trees, animals, and natural processes can achieve consciousness. That consciousness is the Kodama. This means that in traditional understanding, there's typically only one Kodama per forest, not hundreds of individual spirits scattered around like collectible items. The Kodama is the forest's soul, accumulated over centuries or millennia of growth, death, and renewal. But here's where Nioh's version becomes culturally problematic. The game treats Kodama as individual entities that exist to serve human purposes, specifically to provide gameplay benefits to the player. This represents a fundamental inversion of the traditional relationship between humans and these spirits. In Japanese folklore, humans don't collect or command Kodama. Instead, people seeking to enter or use a forest must approach the Kodama with respect, offerings, and careful attention to spiritual protocols. The Kodama decides whether to allow human presence, not the other way around. This isn't just academic distinction. It reflects entirely different worldviews about the relationship between humans and nature. Traditional Kodama stories teach that forests are autonomous spiritual entities deserving of respect and caution. Nioh's Kodama teach that natural spirits exist to reward human exploration and achievement. What mythology topic baffles you the most? Drop it in the comments below, and I'll research it for a future video. Your curiosity drives the content I create. Now let's examine the visual representation, because this reveals another layer of cultural misunderstanding. Nioh's Kodama are portrayed as small, cute, green humanoid figures with glowing bodies. This imagery draws more from Studio Ghibli films than from traditional Japanese spiritual art. Authentic Kodama, when they appear in historical artwork, are typically depicted as indistinct, ethereal presences within trees, sometimes visible as faces in bark, sometimes as shifting lights or shadows among branches. They're not separate from the trees, they're manifestations of the tree's spiritual essence. The cuteness factor in Nioh's design is particularly problematic because it domesticates something that traditional folklore treats with profound reverence and fear. Real Kodama stories often involve people who disrespect forests facing severe consequences, getting lost permanently, suffering mysterious illnesses, or experiencing what practitioners call spiritual displacement. Here's the first major issue that changes everything about how we should understand these spirits. Traditional Kodama possess what folklore scholars term territorial consciousness. They're not wandering spirits that happen to live in forests. They are the forests in spiritual terms. This means that disturbing a Kodama doesn't just anger an individual spirit. It disrupts an entire ecosystem's spiritual balance. Traditional Japanese communities had elaborate protocols for entering Kodama forests, including purification rituals, offerings, and specific routes that avoided the most spiritually sensitive areas. Nioh's approach of casually walking up to Kodama and collecting them would be considered spiritually catastrophic in traditional contexts. It's roughly equivalent to walking into a cathedral and rearranging the altar decorations without permission. Not just disrespectful, but actively harmful to the spiritual integrity of the space. The game's reward system makes this even more problematic. In Nioh, finding Kodama increases your maximum elixir capacity and provides other gameplay benefits. This creates what anthropologists call spiritual commodification, the transformation of sacred relationships into transactional exchanges. Traditional interactions with Kodama were never about humans receiving benefits. They were about maintaining harmony between human communities and forest ecosystems. People might receive the Kodama's permission to gather specific plants, hunt certain animals, or pass through particular areas, but always within careful limits and with ongoing obligations to protect the forest's well-being. Please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already. Your subscription truly means the world to me, as this channel is still growing, and every bit of support helps me bring you these deep cultural explorations. The second transformation is even more significant. Nioh presents Kodama as universally benevolent spirits that always help the player. This completely eliminates what traditional folklore considers their most important characteristic: their role as guardians who can be either protective or dangerous depending on how they're approached. Real Kodama stories include numerous accounts of people who entered forests without proper respect and faced serious consequences. These aren't evil spirits punishing people arbitrarily. They're protective consciousnesses defending their territories from inappropriate intrusion. The most famous example involves the Kodama of Mount Fuji's forest, known as Aokigahara. Traditional accounts describe this Kodama as particularly powerful due to the forest's age and spiritual significance. People who enter without proper spiritual preparation often report feeling overwhelming confusion, losing their sense of direction even on familiar paths, or experiencing what locals call Kodama Kakushi, being hidden by the Kodama until they demonstrate appropriate respect. Nioh's version eliminates this protective function entirely. The game's Kodama never challenge the player, never require spiritual preparation, and never demand respect for the forest ecosystem. They exist purely to reward the player's exploration, which fundamentally misrepresents their role in traditional spiritual ecology. This connects to a broader pattern in how video games adapt spiritual concepts from other cultures. The interactive nature of gaming requires that supernatural elements serve gameplay functions, which often means transforming complex spiritual relationships into simple reward mechanisms. But here's what makes the Kodama case particularly concerning to traditional practitioners. Unlike many mythological creatures, Kodama are still considered active spiritual presences in contemporary Japan. There are forests throughout Japan where people continue to practice traditional Kodama protocols, making offerings and seeking permission before entering. When video games like Nioh present these spirits as collectible helpers, it can create confusion about how to appropriately approach real Kodama encounters. Some spiritual practitioners worry that people influenced by game representations might inadvertently disrespect actual Kodama, potentially causing spiritual problems for themselves and damage to forest ecosystems. The issue extends beyond individual spiritual encounters. Traditional Kodama relationships were part of broader systems of forest conservation. When communities believed that forests had powerful spiritual guardians who required respect and careful management, it created strong cultural incentives for sustainable forestry practices. Game representations that strip away the demanding, protective aspects of Kodama may inadvertently undermine cultural mechanisms that have helped preserve Japan's sacred forests for centuries. Comment below about which aspect of this spiritual misrepresentation concerns you most. Do you think video games have a responsibility to accurately represent spiritual concepts from other cultures? Or is creative adaptation acceptable even when it changes fundamental spiritual meanings? Here's what's particularly complex about this situation. The developers at Team Ninja aren't maliciously misrepresenting Kodama. They're working within the constraints of video game design, which requires that supernatural elements serve clear gameplay functions. The problem is that traditional Kodama relationships don't fit easily into reward-based gaming mechanics. Real Kodama encounters are about ongoing relationship maintenance, not one-time benefit collection. They require understanding complex local spiritual histories, not just finding hidden collectibles. They involve accepting limitations on human behavior, not receiving power-ups for exploration. This creates what game studies scholars call mechanical reductionism. Complex cultural concepts get simplified to fit gaming systems, often losing their most important characteristics in the process. The visual design issues compound the spiritual problems. Nioh is cute. Glowing Kodama create emotional responses completely different from traditional Kodama encounters, which were typically described as awesome in the original sense, inspiring reverential fear and deep respect. Traditional Kodama encounters left people with profound awareness of their place within larger natural systems. Nioh's Kodama encounters leave players with satisfaction at finding collectibles and receiving gameplay rewards. These are fundamentally different types of spiritual experiences. Some Japanese spiritual practitioners have noted that the global popularity of games like Nioh creates a kind of spiritual colonization, where foreign interpretations of sacred concepts become more widely known than the authentic traditions they're based on. This is particularly problematic because it can influence how even Japanese young people understand their own spiritual heritage, as game versions become more familiar than traditional folklore versions. The mystery deepens when you consider that some traditional practitioners claim that creating or consuming entertainment based on Kodama can actually affect real spiritual relationships. They argue that treating these spirits as fictional characters or game mechanics can disrupt the delicate spiritual balances that Kodama exists to maintain. Whether or not you believe in literal spiritual effects, the cultural implications are significant. When sacred relationships get transformed into entertainment mechanics, entire ways of understanding human relationships with natural environments can be lost. But here's what makes this situation even more complex. Some scholars argue that video games like Nioh, despite their spiritual inaccuracies, might be the primary way many people worldwide first encounter Japanese spiritual concepts. This creates opportunities for deeper cultural education, but only if players eventually learn about the authentic traditions behind the game adaptations. The challenge is that games are designed to be complete experiences in themselves. Most players won't seek out additional information about the real spiritual concepts behind game elements, which means their understanding remains limited to the game's interpretation. So what have we discovered? Nioh's Kodama represent much more than creative adaptation. They're a case study in how interactive media can fundamentally transform spiritual concepts from other cultures. The game's version eliminates the demanding, protective aspects of Kodama that are central to their traditional spiritual function, replacing them with unconditionally helpful collectibles. This transformation reflects broader patterns in how Western media adapts Eastern spiritual concepts, often emphasizing the appealing aspects while removing the challenging spiritual requirements. The result is entertainment that feels spiritual but lacks the transformative demands that authentic spiritual relationships require. Understanding these differences doesn't mean we can't enjoy games like Nioh, but it does mean recognizing that we're engaging with creative interpretations rather than authentic spiritual traditions. The real Kodama of Japanese folklore remain what they've always been: powerful, demanding guardians of forest ecosystems who require genuine respect, not collectible helpers waiting to reward human exploration.